The story my dad loved telling more than any other always began the same way. Every single time, he would lean back in his chair, smile slightly, and say, "Sometimes the smartest man in the room is the one who says the least, until the exact right moment." Then he would begin the story of the day: a small-town bank, a crooked contractor, and two exhausted young parents walked into a meeting and came out with their entire situation turned upside down. It all happened in 1973, long before strict banking regulations, long before digital paperwork, and long before companies felt pressured to double-check every small detail. Back then, many small-town banks still operated mostly on trust, handshakes, and paperwork that wasn't always reviewed as carefully as it should have been. That was exactly how my parents nearly lost everything, but it was also how their lawyer turned the entire situation into what my dad always called the greatest legal ambush I've ever seen. In the early 1970s, my parents were young and just beginning their life together. They didn't have much money, but after years of saving every spare dollar, they finally managed to put together a small down payment on a modest ranch house out in the country. It wasn't meant to be anything fancy, just a simple home where they could raise their two young children and build a quiet, stable life. The local bank approved the mortgage and arranged for a contractor, let's call him Bob, to build the house. At first, everything seemed fine. Bob had a good reputation around town and was working on several houses at once. The bank trusted him completely, and since my parents had never built a house before, they assumed the professionals knew what they were doing. Within a few weeks, however, the problems began to appear. Bob rarely came to the construction site himself. Instead, he sent crews who seemed to have little idea what they were doing, and the mistakes started piling up one after another. One day, the framers built a wall straight through the middle of the space where the bathtub was supposed to go. Apparently, the architect had forgotten to erase a line on the blueprint, and instead of questioning it, the workers simply built exactly what they saw. Another time, my mom opened the kitchen cabinets and noticed something strange. When she mentioned it to one of the workers, he casually told her not to put anything heavy inside them. Confused, she asked why. The worker explained that the cabinets weren't attached to the wall studs at all. They had been nailed directly into the drywall, with roofing nails. It only got worse from there. The opening for the garage door had been framed facing the living room instead of the driveway. Plumbing was installed incorrectly, electrical wiring was sloppy, tiles were uneven, and entire sections of the house had to be ripped out and rebuilt multiple times. What should have been an exciting chapter in my parents' lives slowly turned into a nightmare. At the time, my mom was a stay-at-home mother living in a cramped rental house with two small children, and my dad was working two jobs just to keep up with expenses. Instead of enjoying the process of building their first home, they spent months arguing with contractors and begging for basic problems to be fixed. Through it all, the bank and Bob treated them as if they were the problem. They brushed off my mom's concerns, told my dad he didn't understand construction, and insisted everything would be fine once the house was finished. But the problems never stopped. Eventually, the day came for the bank's final inspection before approving the mortgage and paying Bob the rest of the construction money. When the bank representative arrived, my parents were already waiting in the front yard. They told him immediately that they refused to sign off on the house. The representative clearly didn't like that. From his point of view, the bank had already paid Bob a large portion of the loan, and now my parents were causing trouble. Without saying much, he walked up to the front door, clearly intending to prove that everything was perfectly fine. But the moment he grabbed the doorknob and pulled the door open, the entire thing came off the frame and collapsed on top of him. Not just the door. The whole door frame and casing fell apart. It had simply been wedged into place without a single nail. My dad always said the man stood there in stunned silence for a few seconds, still holding the doorknob while the door lay on the ground at his feet. That was the moment the situation stopped being awkward and started becoming ugly. The bank immediately called Bob and demanded that he personally supervise the project. For the first time, he actually showed up. Unfortunately, it quickly became clear that Bob himself wasn't much more competent than the crews he had hired. Even after his so-called fixes, the house was still full of dangerous and expensive problems. So, my parents refused once again to sign the final approval. That was when the threats started. Bob threatened to sue them for breach of contract, and the bank threatened foreclosure. My parents were terrified. They had almost no savings beyond their small down payment. If the situation turned into a long legal battle, They wouldn't be able to afford it. The bank had lawyers. Bob had lawyers. My parents had 2 children and a bank account that was barely holding together. Eventually, exhausted and scared, they went to see a local attorney named Tom. My dad always said he could tell the situation looked hopeless the moment Tom began reading through the paperwork. He carefully examined the construction contracts, the bank documents, the inspection reports, and the long list of construction problems. As he read, his expression grew more serious. My parents sat quietly, convinced they were about to hear the worst. Finally, Tom leaned back in his chair. For a moment, he didn't say anything at all. Then suddenly, he smiled. It wasn't a polite smile. It was the kind of smile someone has when they realize something very interesting. Calmly, he said, "Let's schedule a meeting. Tomorrow?" The next afternoon, everyone gathered at the bank. My parents sat on one side of the conference table next to Tom. Across from them were the bank representative, the bank's attorney, Bob, and Bob's attorney. Before anyone else could even begin speaking, Tom placed his briefcase on the table and calmly said, "My clients have decided they no longer want the house." The room went completely silent. Then someone laughed. Bob shook his head and said, "Don't want the house? That's ridiculous." Tom simply nodded. "Yes," he replied calmly. "They've decided they don't want it." Bob's attorney smirked and said, "Well, it's already built." Without reacting, Tom reached into his briefcase and placed a document on the table. "My clients would like you to remove it," he said. This time, everyone laughed openly. The bank's attorney leaned back in his chair and asked, "Remove the house? Have you lost your mind?" Tom didn't respond. Instead, he slowly slid the document across the table. It was a deed. "My clients," Tom said calmly, "own the land this house is sitting on." The laughter stopped instantly. "They no longer want the house," he continued. "Please remove it from their property." For a moment, no one spoke. Bob's attorney picked up the deed and read it carefully, then slowly turned toward Bob. "You built a house," he said quietly, "on land you don't own." Bob nodded. Across the table, the bank's attorney suddenly turned toward the bank representative. "You didn't finance the land?" he demanded. The man looked confused and said, "No." That was when Tom leaned forward slightly and said, "As I mentioned, gentlemen, you are currently trespassing on my client's property." He tapped the deed. "I expect the house to be removed and the land restored to its original condition." My dad always said the silence in that room was unforgettable. In that moment, everyone realized the same thing at once. The bank had financed the construction of a house on land they didn't own. If they tried to foreclose, they would only take possession of the house, but the house couldn't legally remain there. That meant the bank would be stuck with a useless building and no land underneath it. Bob was in even worse trouble. He had already paid a large portion of the construction costs himself. Now he could be forced to tear the entire house down and remove it from the property at his own expense. On top of that, the bank would almost certainly demand repayment for the money they had already given him. In other words, everyone on the other side of the table suddenly realized they were facing a disaster. The tone of the meeting changed immediately. The bank representatives who had been threatening my parents just days earlier were suddenly apologizing. Bob began promising that every single problem would be fixed. The bank's attorney started talking about misunderstandings. Within hours, the threats completely disappeared. Instead, everyone was suddenly eager to cooperate. The house was repaired according to the original blueprints and specifications. Every mistake was corrected. Walls were rebuilt, electrical work was redone, plumbing was fixed, and everything was paid for by Bob. My parents didn't have to spend a single extra dollar. When the repairs were finally finished properly, they signed the mortgage, Bob received the rest of his payment, and the bank quietly fired the representative who had allowed the situation to spiral so badly. For Tom, the lawyer who had orchestrated the entire confrontation, it became the kind of story attorneys love, telling for the rest of their careers. Because sometimes the most powerful legal strategy isn't winning a dramatic courtroom battle. Sometimes it's simply pointing out the one detail everyone else overlooked and letting the consequences speak for themselves. My dad always ended the story the same way. He would shake his head slightly and laugh. "All those experts," he'd say, "and the only person in the room who actually read the paperwork was our lawyer." Then he would pause for a moment and add one final thought. "Never underestimate the power of a single piece of paper in the right hands."